Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 14.2A. I've entitled this video, Factories and Faulty Fairness in the North. This video is going to cover pages 382 to 384. The Factories of the North. The factory system combines several steps of an item's production under one roof. In the mid-1800s, machines took over more and more manufacturing tasks. The range of goods manufactured this way also increased. American factories began to turn out everything from fabric and clothing to shoes, watches, guns, sewing machines, and agricultural machinery. Question number 1. What happened to America's production of manufactured goods when machines took over more and more of the tasks in the mid-1800s? Well, America started to make more things. So there were a lot more products being made by Americans in those factories. And something I wanted you to think about is how that might change the relationship of workers and their value. When one worker is working by themselves, for themselves, they're going to, of course, treat themselves well. But if you are one person of many working in a factory, how might your boss treat you if there's more and more of you and your boss doesn't even know your name? Think about how that might affect relations with bosses and their workers. Conditions for factory workers. Working conditions worsened as the factory system developed. There's the answer to the question I just posed. Employees worked long hours. By 1840, the average workday was 11.4 hours. That's the average workday. Many would get up at 4 in the morning and get home at 7:30 at night. Remember, they had to walk to work. So a lot of times you'd have to wake up that early just so you could get breakfast in and then walk to work, where you'd put in that 11.4 average day. Longer days caused fatigue and on-the-job accidents. Many factory machines had rapidly moving belts and other parts. These belts had no shields for protection, and many workers, especially children, suffered injuries from these belts, including ripping off their fingers. Belts were just one of the many hazards of factory work. Question number 2. As the factory system developed, production greatly increased. However, there were some negative effects of the growth of the factory system. What were some of these negative effects? Well, a couple of them were that employees were working longer and longer hours and that they got very tired at the job. It had a lot of fatigue, and that fatigue led to accidents. And at that time, there was no workers' compensation for injuries. If you got hurt at the workplace, not only would your workplace not pay you for that injury, they might fire you for it. So this was one of the many negative impacts of the improvements in the factory system, but led to a reduction of treatment for the workers themselves. Employees often worked under harsh conditions. In the summer, factories were hot and stifling. The machines gave off heat, and there was no such thing as air conditioning at that time. Likewise, in the winter, workers were often cold because most factories had no heating. No laws existed to control working conditions or protect workers. Factory owners were often more concerned about profits than about employees' comfort and safety. Question 3. What were some of the tough climate conditions faced by the factory workers at that time? Well, during the summer months, there was no air conditioning, so they suffered brutal heat. And in the winter, the opposite was true. Most factories had no heating, so it was often extremely cold. Question number 4. What type of help did the workers get from the government at that time? No help, because there were no laws to control working conditions or to protect the workers themselves. Question 5. Why were factory owners not concerned about worker safety or comfort? Because those things cost money, and at that time, the factory owners cared about profit. As you know, it's a capitalistic society, so the money that you make is based on, after you subtract all your expenditures, whatever money you have left over from sales is profit. Well, if you're spending some of that profit on safety features, then that's going to cut into your overall money that you're making. And since the government didn't force you to put in safety features, many factory owners said, we're not going to do it. Child labor was also a serious problem. Children in factories often worked 6 days a week and 12 hours or more a day. So think about some of the complaints that you have about school and compare your hours you put into that. The work was dangerous and hard. Young workers tended machines in mills and worked underground in coal mines. Reformers called for laws to regulate child labor, shorten work hours, and improve conditions. Many years passed before child labor regulations became law. Connections to today, child labor laws. In the United States today, federal laws place strict limits on the work children can do. The Fair Labor Standards Act limits the hours that a child under the age of 16 can work. It also prohibits children from certain dangerous jobs, such as working in logging or operating a crane. States also have child labor laws, which are sometimes even more strict than federal laws. And now we can answer some of the questions. Question number 6. What were some of the negative challenges faced by children who worked in the factories at that time in history? Well, they were working 6 days a week and 12 or more hours a day, so at least 72 hours a week. The work could be dangerous. The work was hard. There were no safety features for those children, and also that meant they weren't going to school, so therefore they weren't getting an education. Therefore, they might have a very limited set of skills to help them get a job that wasn't as hard or dangerous or difficult, or not even that even paid that well at that time. So these were some of the challenges faced by these children. Question 7. What were 3 things reformers demanded laws do at that time in our history? Number 1, shorten the work hours, regulate the child labor, like have rules in place for the child labor, and 3, improve the conditions for those children. Workers attempt to organize. Workers tried various ways to gain better conditions in the workplace. By the 1830s, they began organizing into unions. Skilled workers formed trade unions. These were groups of workers with the same trade or skill. The idea was that by working together, union members would have more power than they would as individuals. Safety in numbers. There's power in numbers. Question number 8. What is a trade union? Well, from the back of the book, it says the following. A trade union is, quote, a group of workers with the same trade or skill. And they get together to work on things that they care about. Question number 9. Why did workers believe forming trade unions would help their situation? Well, if you're one person, it's harder to stand up to the bosses. But if it's all of you working together as one group, you have more power. In New York City, skilled workers wanted to receive higher wages and limit their workday to 10 hours. Groups of skilled workers formed the General Trades Union of the City of New York. The workers staged a series of strikes in the mid-1830s. A strike is a refusal to work in order to put pressure on employers. Question number 10. What were the 2 big demands that skilled workers demanded at that time? And these are the basic 2 demands that people always want, and that is higher wages and a shorter work day. So they basically want more pay for the hours they're working and not to work as many hours. Question 11. What is a strike? A strike is when a group of workers refuse to work in order to put pressure on the employers. So it's their way of saying, we are not going to work those machines in the factory until you listen to our concerns. That is what a strike is. And a strike is the most powerful weapon that workers have in order to get some of the things that they want. Going on strike was illegal in the early 1800s. In addition to the threat of losing their jobs, workers who went on strike faced punishment for breaking the law. In 1842, a Massachusetts court ruled that workers did have the right to strike. However, workers would not receive other legal rights for many more years. Question number 12. What were some of the risks faced by workers who tried to go on strike during the early 1800s? Well, number 1, they could lose their jobs. They could get fired by their employers. And number 2, they could actually go to jail. Going on strike was illegal at that time, and it wasn't until 1842 that that changed. African Americans in the North. In the North, slavery had largely disappeared by the 1830s. Still, racial prejudice, an unfair opinion of a group, and discrimination, unfair treatment of a group, remained. White men in New York no longer had to own property in order to vote. Few African Americans enjoyed this right. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania passed laws to keep African Americans from voting. Question number 13. What had disappeared in the North by the 1830s? Slavery. So that's good, but then you still have questions 14 and 15. What does the word prejudice mean for question 14? Prejudice is an unfair opinion of a group. So prejudice isn't an action per se, it's a mentality, it's a belief system. So it's in the brain. It's hard to see prejudice in someone's brain, but when it takes action, you get to number 15. Discrimination is the unfair treatment of a group. So that is the act. You can see discrimination a lot easier with the eyes than you can see prejudice. Question 16. What was the big area of discrimination for African Americans living in the North at that time? Voting. In many, many places, African Americans were denied the right to vote. Even though slavery was illegal, they were still finding it very hard to be treated as equals in the North. In addition, most communities in the North did not allow African Americans to attend public schools. Many communities also kept them from using other public services. African Americans often had to attend poor quality schools and go to hospitals that were reserved only for them. In the business world, a few African Americans found success. In New York City, Samuel Cornish and John B. Russwurm founded Freeman's Journal, the first African American newspaper, in 1827. In 1845, Macon B. Allen became the first African American licensed, or given official authority, to practice law in the United States. Most African Americans, however, lived in poverty in the mid-1800s. Question number 17. What were two other ways African Americans faced discrimination in the North at that time? Well, not being allowed to attend public schools is a huge one. Also, being told they can't use certain public services or having to use services that were designed specifically for them, which were never as high of quality as they should have been or as the whites were getting. Question number 18. While some African Americans, such as Samuel Cornish and others, were able to find financial success, what was an economic reality for most African Americans in the North at that time? The reality, sadly, was most of them were living in poverty by the mid-1800s. Women workers. Women also faced discrimination in the workplace. Employers often paid women half as much as they paid male workers. Men kept women from joining unions and wanted them kept out of the workplace. In the 1830s and 1840s, some female workers tried to organize. Sarah G. Bagley, pictured on the right, a weaver from Massachusetts, founded the Lowell Female Labor Reform Organization. In 1845, her group petitioned for an 10-hour workday. Because most of the workers were women, the legislature did not consider the petition. However, movements like the one led by Sarah Bagley paved the way for later movements to help working women. And you can see that bar graph shows you, and that is from 2018, and I put the website in there if you want to check out my information. You can see that even today, although this was 2018, so a couple years ago, but still, the amount of money that a white man makes in America compared to other wages is not equal as of 2018, and it's still not at the time of this recording in 2023. It's gotten better since the 1840s, but it's still not where it needs to be. Question number 19. What were challenges faced by women in the workplace during that time in history? Well, they faced discrimination such as getting half the pay that men got paid for the same job. Men didn't want women getting into unions, and some men didn't want women in the workplace at all. Question number 20. What role did Sarah G. Bagley play in fighting for the rights of women workers at that time in our history? Well, she led her organization of union workers, and they were trying to get a 10-hour workday. And while she wasn't successful at that time, she did lead the way for other labor movements to eventually make that a reality. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, we have this meme inspired by the prejudice and discrimination that was talked about in this lesson. And just to make it interesting, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.